Hi everyone, welcome to the December 2018 session of Dr. Spotfire. I'm Neil Canungo, Senior Customer Success Manager at TIBCO, and I'll be walking you through today's session. First, a quick word about TIBCO. TIBCO is a global technology leader who for the past 15 years has helped thousands of customers across various industries enable smarter decision-making through data. Whether you need to integrate, analyze, TIBCO is here to help you on your digital journey. At Dr. Spotfire, our slogan is, learning is not driven by answers, but by questions. Every session, we pick up questions posted on TIBCO community and walk through solutions. But throughout the session, if you have any questions, feedback, or follow-ups, please feel free to post them on the chat. TIBCO is a global organization. Our Dr. Spotfire lab is based in the US West Coast, where we are broadcasting from today. This is our crew. As I've mentioned, my name's Neil, a Customer Success Manager. We also have Ninad Sawe, who works really hard to find good feature sessions for you and make sure we have the best content out there. Robert Brushenko helps us with the post-processing of the session, including great summaries of all the content on our TIBCO community. Anna, our campaign manager, makes sure you can register, get reminders, and have access to the session. And today's feature session is Sean Connors, a solutions consultant here at TIBCO. As I mentioned last time, Spotfire 10 was just released last month in November, and for all sessions moving forward, we'll be using the new Spotfire 10 for both the feature and the Q&A sessions. Today, Sean will be doing a deep dive exploration of Spotfire 10's new data canvas. The data canvas provides immersive, inline, and smart data preparation. He'll be showing how to connect, blend, clean, transform, and prepare data, creating an auditable data lineage for easy editing and interactivity. So with that, Sean, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen, and I'm going to start with a view of Spotfire 10. And here we're looking at an example that an analyst or a user has put together with several data sets that they are working with in this file. And we're not spending time today on our visualizations, filters, or other fine features we have with Spotfire 10, but instead we're going to spend time with our data canvas. The data canvas where we can bring in data, transform data, do some data blending, and different other techniques, many of which we're going to show over the next 20 minutes or so. To access the data canvas, you'll have an icon in the bottom left of your screen. Clicking on that will open up the data canvas. And to start, I thought I'd just show what has happened with this particular file and just walk through an example of what you might see in a data canvas. At the top of the data canvas, you'll see the data table you're working with, along with some features you can perform on the table itself. And then you'll see the nodes and how those nodes are related to one another, followed by information and data samples of those nodes at the bottom of your data canvas screen. In this example, we can see the first thing that was done is a user added an Excel sheet in here. If I click on that, I can see the information and data related to that Excel sheet. I can also click on the little database icon here and decide how I want to work with this data from now on. I can always bring in new data when I open the Spotfire file. I can bring in new data when possible, so that's if I have access to the source, get the new data. If not, just keep the old data as it was. Or I can use stored data. So I'm going to keep the stored data. I'm not going to have it reload on open, but I'm going to leave open the possibility to reload the data while I'm working with it. The next step that happens here in my data canvas is I can see some rows were added to this file. In this case, somebody brought in, or the user brought in another Excel file and performed the added rows function in Spotfire. If I click on the edit settings, I can step into these edit settings and see the actual settings that happened. I can even go in and start editing this, but we'll look at this a little further later on. What's worth pointing out, as you've probably seen already, is there's many things that you can click on for information and for altering what you're working on in Spotfire. They may be those database icons, these gear icons that allow you to perform editing. They could be plus signs that allow you to change and set some operations in between your nodes. Or, as we can see in this particular case, on this node where I've added some columns, I can see that there's an icon here with the number 1 on it. And if I go to the information down below, I can see a calculated column was created. Clicking on that calculated column will show me some information about how that column was created inside of Spotfire. And in this case, I can see I used a date diff function, or the user used a date diff function to create a new column in Spotfire. Finally, for this data table, we see the in table. Maybe the data view is a nice way to look at it from there. But the important thing to look at here is this entire canvas, this audit trail, if you will, this lineage, the practices that were done to bring data into Spotfire and transform it and set it up for the data table that I'm working with. So what I'm going to do now is actually walk through some of these steps. And we'll start out rather simply. Let me minimize this Spotfire file and go to another Spotfire window. So here I have a Spotfire file. As a matter of fact, I've actually got it loaded already. So let me close out this file. My Spotfire 10 analyst client is here. And some of the steps that I'm working with here are many of them, as a matter of fact, you can use in our Spotfire 10 business author, our thin client. Here, what we're going to do is we're going to add a simple data set. In my Excel folder, I have some data that I can work with. I'm in my Explorer folders. So let's bring in a data set, and let's bring it in from the sales data. If I click on the sales Excel file, we can just see what the data is before we import it. So we have our rows and columns of data. We won't spend much time in here. We'll bring this file right into Spotfire. So I'll click on sales, drag and drop it into my Spotfire 10. I get a little import setting dialog. I'll accept the import settings as they are because I'm going to do most of my work right here in Spotfire. The first step I have is a view to decide how I want to import it and if I want to perform some transformations. We're going to do this later. We'll step through some examples shortly. So I'm going to say OK, and I've brought the data into Spotfire as I see Spotfire configuring itself to the data. If we were to go to my data canvas icon, again, just the simple icon in the bottom left-hand corner, I can see simply I've brought in a single Excel file. It's created a single Spotfire data table for now. Anytime you need to leave the data canvas, just click on that icon again, and it'll bring you back to your Spotfire 10 interactions. So here I can start from data, start from visualizations or natural language querying that's new to Spotfire 10. But since we're focusing on transformations, data preparation, let's start from the data. Let's look at a couple of data preparation techniques that we have in TIBCO Spotfire and see how those show up in the canvas after we perform them. So now looking at the data panel, I can see the data that I've imported into Spotfire is reflected in the categories that they show up in. Numeric values, time, location, categorical or string values are here. If I were to click on any one of them, I can see that there's some natural examples and some relations built by Spotfire's AI engine. Those will be for another Dr. Spotfire session. For now, let's focus on the preparation. So here with the discount column selected, I can see some information such as some metrics about the column because it's numerical, a little bit of a histogram of how it's created, some information of the data, how it's spread about, and then some information about the data itself, how it's categorized. It's categorized as numerical, how it's formatted. Well, perhaps I want to change that to a currency format. I can do that there. And I can also see that there's some other information here, such as the fact that there are empty values here. There are two. I can replace those here with one of the options that I have in the drop-down. For now, let's do a specific value. We'll just say 0. We'll assume that if they're empty, there was no discount applied to the sales data. Hit return. Now our empty values are taken care of. And I can see now all the values in here, which I can click to sort or select the unique values and see all the unique values that are in here. Let's do a couple other data preparation steps here. One, let's go to something other than a numerical value. We'll look at a business unit. Since we're not looking at a numerical value, this display will change a little bit accordingly to the string values we see here. So we see the unique count of values here. We see what those values are. We can also see some information about how it's categorized once again. We can also see our all in our unique values in here. Now, one thing that pops up to me that jumps out, is that there's technology and there's tech in this particular value column. So I might want those to be the same. So let me go ahead and just click on tech, and I'm going to replace the value. And now I'm going to replace that with the value technology, apply that. So now I don't have those duplicate things. They're collected together in a single value in this column. So I've performed that activity. One other thing I might want to do is split the columns. Now, not really a candidate for splitting here based off the values in this column, but if I look at customer name, perhaps I wanted to grab the last names and first names from my customer names. I can perform a quick split column action here. The split column uses a lot of what Spotfire does, kind of naturally looks at your data and says, I recommend this is how you split this. In this case, it says, let's use the space. Let's make 2 new columns. I'll accept that. We'll click that, and it splits those columns for me. And in fact, with one of these, I'm going to click on, let's click on the second one here that was split. And I'm going to go into that. And a little delay here, working remotely on my Zoom session. There we go. I'm going to go to that second column, and I'm going to choose to rename that column. And when I rename that column, I can do that directly from my data preparation screen. So let's call this last name. So the point of making these steps were to show off some of the things we can do with the data, but also to now go back into our data panel, our data canvas, pardon me, and if I look at what's happened, there's some values, some icons have appeared in my canvas, and if I want to look at more information about what's happened, I can click on these and see things like, okay, I performed a replaced value. The previous value for the business unit column, there was tech. I replaced it with technology. That happened in 2 places. Looking at my in data table, this node, I can see some other activity that happened. I created a calculated column using that split expression, and I created a calculated column which I then renamed to last name using that split expression. So this points out in our data canvas an example that when I bring in data into Spotfire and when I do some data preparation steps in the panel, I can see the activity that's taken place inside the canvas. As a matter of fact, if I ever wanted to take this, let's, for example, go back to this replace value. If I wanted to edit from here, I can click on the little gear icon and decide to edit how I replace that value. Or I might want to come in here and just say, you know what, let me remove that altogether. And I can replace that technology switch I made. I can remove that directly from the data canvas. One other thing I want to point out is just a simple, let's bring in another data set here. I'm going to drag in shipments. So when you bring in data to Spotfire, let's say you bring in multiple sets of data at once, or one when there's another one that's brought in, you'll get the option to decide how to work with that data. Perhaps add it as a new table, add it as new rows, or add it as columns. We're going to do this next, but in this case, I'm just going to bring this as a new table and take into account the situation where you have multiple data tables. When you have multiple data tables in Spotfire and you are in the data canvas, at the top here, you can switch between them or cycle between your tables by using the arrows and see the lineage or audit trail for those data tables by quickly selecting, switching through there at the top. So let's go put together what we saw here. And we'll do this pretty simply and pretty quickly. You'll see that this is a snap partly because of Spotfire's interface and partly because Spotfire makes recommendations for you on how to build this. So I'm going to close this particular file that I had open with my sales and my shipments. I'm going to open up my Explorer folder again and go into a folder where I have some data on insurance claims. I'm going to select every single one of these files. I have 3 of them. I'm going to drop those into Spotfire. Again, I have my import settings from Excel dialogues that I'm just simply going to click OK and accept and bring in that data into Spotfire. And here are those data sets. Now, Spotfire has already made a recommendation for me, and you'll see that in just a moment. It looked at my 2017 claims, and it recommended bring this in as a new table. More than that, it looked at my 2016 claims worksheet, and it recommended that I add the rows to the other data table the other worksheet that I brought in. And if I look at this gear, click on that icon, I can see a sample of that and the logic applied by Spotfire to bring in that data. So if I look at the result set on the right, I can see the original data in my lighter blue, the new data from the other worksheet in my darker blue. On the left, I can see the matching logic that was performed here. And as a matter of fact, if I wanted to edit any of this, I could remove and add these particular steps using the dialogue that we have in Spotfire, dialogues we have here in Spotfire to add rows or merge data here. I'll accept this. And next I'll go to my other worksheet, this location. It's made the suggestion I can add this as a new table, but I have a feeling I might want to join this. And what I can do now is choose on how I want to add this, not as rows, but I'm going to perform a join. And I'm going to click on the join icon here, add columns. And if I click on my dialog, again, to edit how I'm adding these, I can see that here is an example that Spotfire created for me. And what Spotfire identified were there are two columns that it recommended performing the join between the two worksheets. And again, I can see my original data along with my new data based off of what is these colors, these blue colors down here. I can add a match if I want to add another key between the tables. I can edit the match that exists or remove the match that exists. But the thing that's really, really slick about this is looking at these join settings. So I have a left outer join recommended, which is fine. But if I want to perform one of these other joins, I get a little icon showing me how the join works, some definition, and then I get an example. So if I have left outer join here and I look down at my example, simply by brushing over the example tables, I'll see how that join performs. Likewise, if I were to select full outer join, I can see how the join will perform by brushing over the examples in the bottom here. I'll accept left outer join, click on OK. Click on OK one more time. And Spotfire now performs the add rows, the add columns, and if we go to the data panel, there we have that data lineage, our audit trail that we had created before in the previous example is now ready to work in the example we have here. Now, I've worked with Excel files prior to this, but it really doesn't matter your source. And just to prove that, I'll close this, and we'll close this and we'll just do the simple thing, connect to a database. I happen to have SQL Server running that I connect to, but if you look at your connectors, and again, this will be another Dr. Spotfire session, I'm sure, oops, excuse me, you will see there's a long list of connectors, including our pretty awesome TIBCO data virtualization solution. But I'm going to go to SQL Server, click on that, make a new connection, connect to my database, oops, excuse me, type in the correct field. I don't want to edit my server name. Click on my user information here. And of course, you might have this automatically set up for you or set up through some sort of Windows or other type of authentication. Select my database. I've created one called Data Canvas specifically for this session. And from that database, I will highlight the data tables I want to bring in and bring those in to Spotfire. And then I can decide how I want to work with these. These aren't very big data tables. I'm going to work with these. I'm going to import these instead of working with these as external data. And again, I can see and perform the same techniques that I did with a worksheet, or I could add worksheets to these and work with them together. So we can see that here. Let's bring in this one. We'll bring this table in as new rows to the 17, and we'll bring in the location as new columns to our 17. We'll import those, and we'll bring in the data into Spotfire again and have it ready to go. You'll notice my icons in my data canvas have changed a little bit because it indicates that I'm coming from a database rather than a worksheet, hence the red database icon. So from here, what I want to focus on is some of the things you can do inside the canvas or when you bring data in that will be reflected in the canvas. And let's do some transformations. So again, I'm going to close this out. And let's start with a transformation, a pivot transformation. So here I have a data table, and I'll open it up for you so we can take a look at the data table. And it's a simple one, but in this data table we have our locations, our departments, the quarters, and then some sales numbers for those departments and the regions. So I'm going to import this data into Spotfire, but as an analyst, the way I wanted to work with this is I don't want necessarily a row for every quarter. I just want the aggregated sales. So I'm going to perform a pivot transformation. I import the data into Spotfire. When I import that data into Spotfire, there's that icon, transform data. We saw this before. It pops up there. I can click on transform data. I can click on what transformation I want to use. There's quite a few to choose from. And one thing I should point out, either in the data canvas or from this dialog, there's this wonderful help, contextual help, that will help you get ready and understand how these things like transformations are performed. But I'm going to insert a pivot. And when I insert that pivot, I have some dialogues, a dialogue that I can fill out. Now the pivot takes just a few settings. So in this case, I'm going to make my row identifiers, my location, my column titles. I'm going to make my department. My values are going to be my amount. I'm going to aggregate those by using the sum aggregation. I'm also going to transfer into here my region. Now, if I look at the bottom and in the pivot, the bottom, the sample is very helpful. I can see how my columns are identified, and I can see how the data is prepared for me. I can see I've got repetitive values in my transferred columns. So let me just change the way that that is performed. Instead of concatenate, I'm going to do a unique concatenate. And I'm actually going to change the naming pattern to only show the name of that column region rather than the aggregation as well. Likewise, in my values, I'll do the same thing and show only the name so I can see the amount. Here's my result. I click on OK, and now that data is ready to view in Spotfire. And as a matter of fact, I go to the data canvas and I highlight that node of the imported table. I can look at what has happened here. And if I decide to, I can remove the transformation, I can edit the transformation, or replace data, which we'll do in the very next topic. So if I decided to remove the transformation, take a look at my data here. I'll click on this, remove the transformation, remove the transformation. I get a little notice, hey, here's a warning, we're gonna remove this. I'll get another icon, and this is just kind of telling me that, wait, there's some new data coming in because it wasn't included in the transform result. No problem, that's what I want. I click OK, and now this data table represents the same data as we imported. So let's do one more transformation, and in the next transformation, we're going to also cover some other topics in this data canvas, such as reloading and replacing data. So in this case, I'm going to use some expense data. So if I highlight or open this Excel file, I can see I've got a row of expenses, 20 rows of expenses here. And in these expenses, I have a column for each month, January, February, March, April, May, June, such and so on. So what I want to do is actually have one column for month. So in this case, we're going to use an unpivot transformation. I'll drag and drop, import that data. And in this case, let's transform this with an unpivot. Unpivots are very, very simple to use. In fact, they're so simple, there's one caution I want to provide. I'm going to add the columns that I'm going to pass through. So these are going to be unchanged. I'm going to add the ones that I'm going to transform. So instead of having a column for each one of these, they're going to be in a single column. Their values will exist in a single column. Here's my little just heads up. Don't forget to change your column names. If I look at my preview here, I can see that my transform column says category. I want that to be month. And instead of value, I want this to be expense amount. We'll just call it amount. And now I click on OK. and OK, and OK. That data now is in Spotfire. And again, looking at our data canvas, here is an example of what's been brought in with the transformation that's taken place. One thing I wanted to get into now, though, is the data here. If I look at this data, I have the option at any time to reload or re-import the data while I'm working with it. So if I click on my data table, I can see how it looks now, and here I can see what's happened with this data as well. But if I ever want to replace or reload this data, I can do that as well. So before I do that, though, let me go into one more step here. I'm going to go into my file itself so we can just see the replacement, open up my Excel file, and I'm just going to enter a new employee ID for, I'll just call my type of expense hotel, and we'll call this training for my department. And we'll just enter an amount like $1 million for January. So a very large amount there. We'll save this and close this. And in Spotfire, what I'll do is quickly close my data panel, and we'll just quickly create a bar chart. And we'll do a bar for each month. And we'll look at the expense amount for all those months. And now we'll go back to our data canvas. And here what we can do is reload or replace our data. And so if I wanted to reload the data, there's a little icon right here. I click reload. Now remember, if we look at our bar chart, if we went back to our bar chart, we can kind of see what that looks like there. When I reload the data, it performs that reload action. If I look at it, I can see the last reload was just now. And now going back to my bar chart, I can see that that data has been reloaded with my new expense in there, which was really distorting my bar chart. But I now have that row that I brought in here. Or the other thing I might do is replace the data. Let's say I want to replace the data. And if we, going back to our visualization, we can see that there's only 63 rows of data here. The data haven't been transformed with that unpivot. But if I want to replace the data with an entirely new table, I can come into that data set, click on this, replace the data source, and in this case, let me browse to the file I want to replace it with. It will be my, it will be my expenses to a much larger set of data. As I bring in this data, and this is a good preview, you can see it's got January, February, March, April, just like we had. That needs to be transformed. But as I replace that table and I click OK, the existing transformation is kept. You can see there's a little notice that that was kept as well, and my data is brought into Spotfire and transformed based off of the existing transformation that I made before. And here are the results in my bar chart again, and we would see it in my tabular format as well. A 7,600 row data set has been brought in. So those are the main things I wanted to cover. Let me point out just the last couple things that I want to just mention as references. Your data canvas, you have the lineage, the audit trail. Pay attention to each of the nodes. Clicking on each of the nodes will provide you your information. At each of those nodes, depending on whether they're a data node, you can decide how to handle your data, whether they're a node where you've performed some kind of import of additional data, you can edit that, those settings that you've created before. Or you might want to look at the transformations or calculated columns that you've made at these nodes and edit those as well. And finally, of course, keep in mind the help that's in Spotfire. It's contextual, it's very informative, and enjoy some of the recommendations through Spotfire 10's new AI. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. That was a really great session. I've found the data canvas to be a really big help in my design of analysis. It's much easier for me to go through the lineage and insert new transforms and use the features you showed. So thanks for showing that. I had a couple questions. If you want to go back to your first analysis and share your screen.
Sure.
So I was wondering, you were showing us how to match columns in a later analysis, but in your first analysis, you had multiple columns matched. And can you walk through again why you might want to match multiple columns and how that's different from matching a single column?
Well, assume that you're saying in the add columns. So you're adding matches in both of adding columns and added rows. So when you're adding columns, you can think of the matches in terms of joins. So depending on how the tables are, the original data and the new data is related, your match may have multiple keys. Now, in the example that I used, there was an ID that joined. It's a demo, so conveniently, I have a single key that joins two tables. But should there be multiple keys, you can add matches that identify, in this case, I'm not sure there's a good match that identifies my original table. Maybe it was plan ID to, for some reason, zip code. I could add additional matches so that the join will perform based off of those keys. The other thing I can show here is, let's say we were looking at adding rows. So not a join in this case. We're looking at appending rows. We're looking at merging, a union kind of. So in this case, what you want to do is match the columns that by the names so that, let's say, for example, if we were to look at this cause description, we want to make sure that from the original rows, this cause description matches up to the cause description in the second one, even if it's named something different in the second data set. So I can identify and edit that column name based off of how they should be matched. Now, one thing I'll point out here is perhaps the second data set has no match. If that's the case, you'll see that it just comes in empty. So you're not going to miss data. You're not going to lose data if there's not a match when you're adding rows or merging data. So I hope that addresses the question as it was intended.
Yeah, so if you go back to that view, so what you're showing us is that if your second data table, maybe if it didn't say cause description, it just said description, Spotfire may not know that cause description on one table is the same as the column for cause description, or that's the same as just plain description on the second table. So you can manually match these together so it knows that those are mapped together, is what you're showing us here, correct?
Correct. So for example, perhaps in this data, created date was in the original data. In the second data table, maybe reported date meant the same. They actually intend to mean the same thing. I could add those and match those together so that those dates were in the same column. So you have that correct. If the cause description was called cause description in one data set and description in the second, I can use these dialogues to match those together, look at my preview, and make sure I have that correct.
Awesome. And going back to the columns, the add columns function, and I really want to just go into these for the users, because there's a fundamental difference between adding columns and adding rows for your data as you're structuring it. And the way you should generally think about it is each row is a new observation of different columns, and those columns are attributes. So when you want to add new observations, let's say as new data comes in, new data is created every day, right? So as new data is coming in and you want to just add that in, you would add it as a row if your table structured the right way. Now, if you want to add columns like attributes, so in order to add a column and have it match together, you have to have, as Sean said, a key, which means a similar column in both data tables. So here he has CLID, which is a column that's used in both data tables. Now, if you had multiple columns you wanted to match, like let's say multiple IDs, you could add those matches as well, right, Sean?
That's correct. If the relationship required more than a single key to identify how those two tables were related, you could add those matches. And likewise, you would see how those would interact based off of your join settings as well here. So this is one of the things that's been a really nice addition for people that are blending or joining data inside of Spotfire Analyst tool.
Right, awesome. And coming from a non-SQL background, non-relational database background, the join settings, if you have a left table and a right table, which is just your first table and your second table. The right table is the table you're joining from, and the left table is the table you're joining to. So an inner join is just where those two tables intersect. And the left join is for all the values that match that first table that are also in the second table. Right, Sean? And feel free to explain that better if you have maybe a more eloquent way to put it.
You have that correct. So there are the concepts of outer, inner, left, right that you want to be familiar of. So if you, the good thing here is these these circles are almost concentric here, and these tables are good examples of showing you how it's applied. So I can see if there's a left outer join, and I highlight in this case where the column A matches where column A is in the second table. I can see that those values are brought in, both B, 1 and 6 are both brought in here. So whereas column B, there's no match from the left table to in the right table, so only the value from the left table is brought in because it's a left outer. If that were a right outer, and I look at the same one, no value is brought in at all because the right table doesn't have anything. So left outer or left single match tend to be the most common ones we use inside of Spotfire, I would say, but make use of these examples here. There'll be good ways to become familiar with how these joins work and how your data will look when you bring it in. The other thing I'd point out that has always been beneficial to me is when you're joining data, even when you're adding rows, this status bar in Spotfire, the number of rows, the number of columns that you've got in here are always good indications, and your instincts will help you understand what's happened based off of your add rows and add columns when these change after you perform those actions. So, keep aware of your status bar for your data tables.
Mm-hmm. And in that join screen, if you go back there real quick, just also pointing out, so this right side is a preview pane, so you can see what's going to happen before you actually execute this join. And at the top right, you can change the number of input rows. The preview is only going to give you 1,000, but if you really wanted to see like your full data table, like the full 11,000 or so that you had, you could put that in there, and then you could actually see the entire data table itself and check and verify that this is the actual join you want to do. And of course, if you choose the wrong join, the data canvas allows you to go back and easily just change it with no problem. All right, thank you, Sean. Well, appreciate all of your time and your great demo on the data canvas. I'm going to show my screen now. Can everyone see my screen? Can you see my screen, Sean?
Yes.
Okay. So for the users out there, I wanted to point out that there's the Spotfire X landing page on tibco.com. And this has lots of different quick start videos as well as some on-demand webinars. These are 20 to 30-minute webinars. Some of them show real-time analytics. There's a session on data canvas, some more data canvas topics if you want to learn more about the data canvas here. So be sure to check this page out if you have time. Also wanted to point out on the TIBCO Spotfire YouTube channel, there is a playlist for Spotfire 10, and there are a dozen or so, a couple dozen videos to help you get started and use the tool. There are some training videos here that we've been adding. You have data wrangling, custom expressions, sharing analyses. So these videos are all pretty reasonable length, 1 to 3 minutes, 1 to 4 minutes. So be sure to check them out when you get a chance. So let's see. All right, moving forward, just want to remind everyone that With Dr. Spotfire, you can ask questions on the TIBCO community. You will go to the answer section, and you can just use the hashtag Dr. Spotfire on your question, and we look at those every month and pick some questions to answer during the Q&A session. You can also tweet Dr. Spotfire on Twitter. If you have some confidential data, feel free to email us at drspotfire@tibco.com. And for now, I guess I'll move on into the Q&A. I'm going to just explain which questions I'm going to answer first, so you can decide if you want to stick around for all of these. The first one, I'm going to talk a little bit about some aggregated measures with this downtime question. The second question is going to be an IronPython question on changing bar chart formats. And the third and fourth question are going to be on a TER data function for using Holt winners forecasting to get actual data. I'm going to talk about time series object in TER as well. So, you know, stick around for that if you're interested. So for first, this calculating downtime hourly. So this question was posted by Natasha, and I'm going to show the data that she gave us. So she had one table that had just these rows, these 6 rows here, and it had different downtime. And this was for a certain range, a start time and a stop time. So, you know, we got a couple hours here, and she wanted to show each of these values hourly, even though these are shown on a single range. So I try to take a look at this and understand, you know, was it valid to actually divide this downtime over this whole range? And so I did a Gantt chart to look and see, okay, what are the ranges that are covered? Now, she also provided a second table, which is showing how she wants it to look. And as you see here, she has individual downtimes shown for each row, which is a different timestamp. Because these are actually not uniform across, I was able to deduct that this aggregation, this single value is not evenly split across this whole bar, across this whole range. She has multiple different downtimes, and then she has a sum of all of that being shown for one column here. So wanted to explain some basics on measures and dimensions as well as aggregations. I think we often work through Spotfire, but don't necessarily think about how all of these, how measures and dimensions work together. So ultimately, you can't actually get more granular data if you're inputting a aggregated measure. If you're inputting an aggregated value, you can't break that out into more granular data. So as a quick review, measures are numerical values. Anything numerical can be duration, temperature, sales. Dimensions are non-numerical values. So, you know, names and colors, regions, and aggregations are combined. So you can take multiple types of aggregations like sum and average, and you can aggregate a numerical measure. You can do some aggregations on dimensions, like finding the first color or the last color in this column, or maybe even concatenating all of these, but you can't do an average of a dimension. You can't average the color. You can't average the region or average the name. You can't, you know, you can't sum the name. So, remember that with aggregations, they are a combined form of, you know, measures and dimensions. So you can go from granular data into an aggregation, but you cannot go from an aggregation back into granular data unless that data is already exist in your analysis. You can't input this type of data and then go back into that. So, you know, we use aggregations all the time in charts, and sometimes we may not realize it. So for like a pie chart, for instance, you're doing, this is a sector count, right? The sector size is by, you know, sorry, I have these different row counts, and this is an aggregation of all the rows by these different dimensions, by the genre dimension and each dimensional value of it. And same thing for a bar chart. I have an aggregation, so sum of global sales, and this is for all of these different genres. And what I'm showing here is a video game data set, video game sales. So I have dimensions like name and genre and publisher, and I have measures like year and sales. I wanted to point out that the column names themselves are actually a dimension, and the row numbers are actually a measure. So, you can have those different column names, for instance, or row numbers shown as well. Of course, there's a ton of row numbers here, so you're seeing this cool little design, but those are actually measures and dimensions themselves. If you do want to show like a measure versus a measure, you can use like a scatter plot, and this allows you to select like individual points, whereas with this type of chart, for instance, you are only getting aggregated points. So when I select one of these, for instance, I'm seeing how it's aggregated, how all these individual rows map up to it. So that's just a quick review, and then I'm going to move on to the next question. So let's see here. Okay. So next question was doing switching the chart style through a drop-down. So I have this Google Play data set. This is for some apps. Let's see. This is for some apps in the Google Play Store. And what I'll do is I'll create a text area, and I have these apps colored by content rating, and they're side by side. What I'll do in the text area is I'll go to Edit Text Area, and I'll add a drop down. Sorry. And I'll create a new drop down property name for stack mode. And I wanted to run a script when that value changes. So the script I have, do I have it ready? Copy and paste. Let's see. So this script I want to point out I got from the TIBCO community. There is a great Iron Python page. I always like to remind people of the Iron Python scripting page on TIBCO community, where you can get all kinds of examples of different, changing join type with a button, getting aggregated data, changing visual data, the data table using the visuals. All these different shortcuts are all here in this Iron Python scripting page. So I went to this page, this script, and I simply just copied it and I'm going to use this here. And so it's going to bring in a viz to add a parameter. I'm going to name this viz, and I'm going to select the bar chart. Now this knows on page 1 bar chart that viz is that visualization. And on the script, it's going to say when the stack mode document property is 0, then it changes the stack mode to none. When it's 1, it changes the stack mode to stack. And when it's 2, it changes the stack mode to stack 100%. This is in the Spotfire API. Okay. So here I'm going to do fixed values. And I'm going to say none. And I'm going to make that 0. And I'm going to make this one stacked. Make that 1. And I'll make this one stacked 100%, and I'll make that 2. So I save it. Now, when I change this, you can see as soon as that document property changes, it's changing the bar chart configuration. Okay, I'm going to move on to the third and fourth question. They're both, let's see here, they're both kind of related, so I'm going to kind of do them together. There's two users that wanted using the Holt-Winters data function in R. One user wanted it so that they could get a actual table of values, and the other user wanted to create a bar plot. So if you are familiar with, let me pull up that DXP. So if you are familiar with the Holt-Winters capability that's already in Spotfire, it's in the lines and curves of charts, you can add a Holt-Winters forecast. And what this does is it predicts forecasted values for seasonal data. Now, when you create this, it doesn't actually, it draws the lines in, but it doesn't give you the values for this in any type of data table. The way I have this data set up is, this is actually retail data from the US Census Bureau. So yearly retail data by every month, and you can see it's cyclic in nature. So I'm going to walk through how I create an R function where for the marked rows I can execute this R function and it will draw these values. It'll come up with the predicted values and it'll draw these. So you go to, let's see, so I have in my data function properties, I created this script. Now, the Holt-Winters function is part of the base R package in tear. So it's part of the stats package that comes in the base tear. So you don't actually have to install any new packages. And the predict function is also part of that. So what I'm doing is I'm assigning a variable, and this is the number of periods I want to predict. Since each of these values are for the first of a month, I want to predict for a full year, so 12 months. I create a vector here of dates, so they are sequenced starting on the last date I have in my prediction, or in my actual data, is in August 2018. So starting on September 2018, I want to have a new sequence of predictions. I want to create this sequence of months, and it's going to be a length of period, so 12. It's going to basically create 12 points for me, each on the first of the month starting in September. I'm also going to bring in the category that I'm selecting through the marking. So this takes that category and assigns that category value to every row in this new data table. Then I want to take the values. So the values of the actual source data is here in amount. And I take that value, and I'm going to use, this is a really key part here, TS. So this is our object for time series data. And in order to use the Holt-Winters and the predict functions, you need to have the TS. You need to have a TS object, so not a data frame. So I'm going to use this Holt-Winters function. I'm going to use the myvals TS, the time series object, and I'm going to set seasonal to mult. And that's for multiple. And then I'm going to create a data frame P for the predicted values, and that's going to predict this Holt-Winters over the number of periods, and this tells me to use that prediction interval. And then finally, I'm going to combine all of that together. So now, when I select something and I run that script, it's calculating a fit, a upper bound, and a lower bound. And I added those as columns here so we could view them all together. It may look disjointed here, and that's because in September and August, there's no connecting value. The source data starts in August, or stops in August, and the new predictions start in September. And since they're part of different series, they don't actually connect. But you can actually see that, you know, in all of these between August and September, there's this drop. There's kind of, in every summer, there's these three little spikes, and this last one is August, September. we're seeing the same thing here. One spike, two spike, and then this would be the third spike, and it drops down. So that's telling me it's the same shape. It's also spiking up in December for retail sales, and then dropping again in January, February. Now that this data is in a data table, I can also plot this as any chart I want. So in a Holt Winters line that you draw in a regular bar chart, you would just get these lines drawn in. But since now I have the actual data calculated, I can just add these as values in the bar chart as well. I'm going to just take a quick look at the chat to make sure. Okay. So I have a couple minutes. I'm going to describe a little bit why I structured my table this way and why I brought this category in. So my data source was kind of messy. This was what I downloaded online from the Census Bureau. I had all of these different columns here for the months. You can see, and then there's these rows for the different categories. And then each of these are on a different tab. So let's see, my data panel. So what I did is I copied them all over. This is a cross table I'm showing you before I did it. So I have all of these different months on different columns. And then what I did was I did a unpivot so that I had just the category, the date, and the amount all in these rows. And this is how Sean showed it earlier. And the reason I did that is because I wanted my charts to have each of those categories in the same column, so I could basically set this up so I could do a hierarchy by category, and then I could also do, when I select one of these markings, it's going to mark rows that have that same category. And that way, when I do my data function, I can pass those marked rows over. This is what, in my parameters, the values I'm bringing over, I can pass those marked rows over. And since I've passed those over, it's only going to do the calculation on the rows that have been marked. Therefore, basically, only the different categories that I select. So that's why I built it that way. And then when I took my prediction data, I just joined it into the original data table so that, you know, you see it here. There we go. So now there's all the prediction data is all kind of joined in together here. And that way I could plot it all together from the same data table on the same chart and on the same chart and just use different columns in there. Okay, I think that does it for today's Dr. Spotfire session. Thank you all for joining, and we hope to see you next time.